Welcome to the Roche Idea Lab. Please welcome Angie Howard and Angela Baldwin.
Well, good afternoon and welcome back to the Roche Idea Lab. The Idea Lab is a community where we can come together to discuss the challenges we face as an industry.
My name is Angela Howard.
And I'm Angela Baldwin, and we're your hosts for the Roche Idea Lab. I'm a board-certified anatomical pathologist. I've been working as a pathology liaison in the Medical and Scientific Affairs Division at Roche since April. I work very closely with other members of our Roche team. It's a very collaborative role where I have the opportunity to educate and learn from internal and external partners.
And I'm the regional business manager for our molecular franchise. I have 20 years of healthcare experience, 12 of which have been here at Roche Diagnostics, working in a variety of different functions. In my role, I actually have the opportunity to hear directly from our healthcare executives as well as laboratorians around some of the biggest challenges that impact them today. We're both really looking forward to hearing the ideas of our guests today in the audience, and we welcome your insights. So please feel free to speak up. You'll see some roving mics coming from both of us. So due to our genetic makeup, disease impacts each of us in different ways. Because of this, we cannot take a one-size-fits-all approach. Change really starts with having a more diverse patient population included in clinical trials. That inclusion can help us close that health equity gap. Roche is committed to driving conversations and programs to help close that gap as well. A distinguished panel of experts will take us through the roles that labs play in addressing some of these healthcare disparities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Samira Assad, Dr. Octavia Peck-Palmer, and Dr. Gary Puckrin.
Thank you all for joining us today as we discuss a very important topic. We've titled this session, Inclusive by Design, placing in full view how the laboratory can really be essential in driving health equity and promoting broader access to diagnostics across many patient populations. I will be the moderator for today's discussion. My name is Samira Assad, and I am the Medical Access Partner for Roche Diagnostics in North America. And I'm extremely excited to be taking part in this discussion with our esteemed panelists, Dr. Gary Puckrin, President and CEO of the National Minority Quality Forum, and Dr. Octavia Palmer, AACC's President-elect. It's like AAA needs to be said. Today we'll be delving into some important components related to ensuring equitable access to laboratory solutions, really thinking through the current obstacles that exist in preventing certain communities from being represented in clinical research, the factors necessary to successfully conduct research, and ultimately the types of collaborations that can work to ensure we accelerate bringing broader patient access to diagnostic solutions. So thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you.
And let's begin our discussion with some level setting. Dr. Palmer, I'll start with you. From your respective vantage point, what do you see as laboratory medicine's critical role in promoting health equity and improving access to care?
Yes, so laboratory does have a critical role, and if we think about what health equity really means, it means that a person is able to achieve its highest health potential. With having that in mind, first of all, the field has to acknowledge that inequities do exist. And those inequities start with development of tests, setting those policies, making sure resources are available, and identifying from test menu development, identifying where you provide testing, thinking about policy and guideline development, and then lastly, thinking about who has access to consultation and how are their results interpreted. We can make this happen.
Those are some great points. Dr. Puckrin, any additional comments there?
You know, clinical trials are the foundation to great health. It is not just the science that we acquire from clinical trials, but the findings also inform clinical guidelines. And I live in Washington, D.C., so we think about pay for performance, and those pay for performance is predicated on clinical guidelines. So if you're really going to have equitable healthcare for everyone, everyone has to be in the underlying science. We must make sure that every patient who comes through the front door has access to high quality care, and it all begins with clinical trials.
Absolutely, and some really important points that you both highlighted there. And I think what's important to also recognize, and we at Roche are recognizing this more and more, is that there is also a relationship that's built and cultivated between the laboratorian and the clinician. And the patient is really at the center of all of this. And so through the patient's journey, they will intersect with both the laboratorian as well as the clinician, and really recognizing that that journey also faces a few obstacles. And this really brings me into our second question. And Dr. Puckgreen, I'll pass this one to you. What current roadblocks exist in allowing for laboratorians and clinicians as a whole to be able to engage broader populations within the scope of clinical research?
I mean, one of the places the problem begins is really the fact that our clinical trials are not being conducted in community. I did an article last summer with Janet Woodcock, who was then chair of commission of FDA, and it was talking about the need to bring community clinicians into the research enterprise system because they have the trust of the patients in community. The trials can happen in community, and it becomes an extension of the care experience for the patient. So one of the first barriers we have to overcome is really to make sure that we are putting those trials in community where they're accessible to everyone. People think that minority populations don't want to be in clinical trials. That's not what the data shows. The data shows if you ask them, they will participate, but frequently they're not asked. And so that's the next hurdle that we have to come, is that you have to ask the question, do you want to participate in a clinical trial? And then thirdly, we have to make sure we understand that they have lives that they live. And if we put those trials outside the community during the workday, you create all kinds of complications for them. So you have to be very, very mindful of the patient population that you're recruiting.
That's a really great point, and really understanding, that there are unmet needs that every community brings to the table, and recognizing what those unmet needs are and kind of bridging those gaps, whether it be from a health literacy perspective, whether it be educating the masses on the opportunities that exist for clinical research. Anything to add to that, Dr. Palmer?
I think Dr. Puckgreen said it correctly. When we think about this notion of historically thinking that certain minoritized populations don't want to interact, many times algorithms have been developed that exclude them. And so whereby we have these race-based clinical algorithms that ultimately put them not in a category to be in the inclusion. We can also think about it from the standpoint of the clinical trialist team. They have certain biases, and so they may not even look at what the prevalence of the disease is. So really having a pulse on who am I serving from an in vitro diagnostic standpoint and also from a clinical lab. And I love how he noted you've got to bring the community in, because the community consists of spiritual leaders, barbershops, salons, sororities, fraternities have all played major roles and have initiatives out really to make sure that their community is being served.
Yeah, I love that point. Recognizing that the local grassroots is fundamentally where many patients seek out their educations, and that their communities really engulf them in this education, and being able to partner with many of those community groups in order to bring that education to where the patient exists. Yeah. I love that point. And that really leads us into our next question. And Dr. Puckgreen, I'm going to also pass this one to you. From your experience, what are some of the reasons that some groups are underrepresented in clinical trials across various disease states?
So at the National Minority Quality Forum, we launched something called the Alliance for Representative Clinical Trials because we saw that clinical trials were not happening in community. And what we decided that we wanted to do was to train community clinicians to be principal investigators in trials. So these would be all naive practices that we go in and we start to work with. And the first thing you realize when you open the front door is that their patient panel are very, very large because particularly in the underserved community, they have large Medicare and Medicaid practices. And so in order for them to make ends meet, they end up with large patient panels. So they can't do clinical trials on their own. You can't add the burden of a clinical trial to them. So what we did was we put study coordinators into the practice. We trained the PI, got them certified so that they have oversight, but the actual day-to-day work of doing the clinical trials, we put a study coordinator in there. But then you also had to get someone to engage the community. So we brought together a person that did patient engagement, because once again, these practices, their panels are so large that they don't have time to talk about the benefit of a clinical trial to a particular patient. And so what we decided to do was to educate the community itself about clinical trials, the barbershops, the beauty salons, et cetera, so that when the question of participating in the clinical trial came up, people, it wasn't a foreign language. They didn't go to old myths about Tuskegee and things like that. They were better informed. And so part of bringing clinical trials into these communities is that we have to understand what's going on in these communities and the extra step that we need to take in order to bring them into trials.
And that's a fantastic point that you're making there, especially when it comes to patient inclusion in clinical trials. It's important to mention that there are both intrinsic factors, so there's the biology of the patient, there's their genetic makeup that really allow for the diversity of the population you select. But there's also these social determinants of health that really contribute to the patient's socioeconomic status, where they live, how remote in nature that is to a healthcare system, that also fundamentally works to shape their health outcomes. And so we have to be very mindful in diversifying the demography, not only in terms of those intrinsic factors, but also the extrinsic factors that exist. Anything to add to that point, Dr. Palmer?
I think that we must continue to think about what diversity means. A lot of times we forget that diversity in itself, there's more genetic diversity within a population than it is across the population. And so I love how you noted that it's geography, it's your social, your environmental, and if someone's living in a health desert, they're going to express different genes or profiles. And so we really need to think about, are we capturing all of the diversity that's going to allow us to start building out these therapeutics and targets that will be beneficial for a whole?
Absolutely. I think that multimodal approach is absolutely necessary.
I just want to add one other point, because sometimes when we talk about diversity in clinical trials, we think we're just talking about the minority community. But a good scientist knows that heterogeneity is easier to learn than having a homogeneous population where you don't see the variations. And so diversifying clinical trials actually will speed up the scientific process, because you can see those differences that you won't see if you're just dealing with a homogeneous population.
Yeah, and that really leads well into our next question, which is, according to the NIH, inclusivity in clinical trial research is essential to have a wide range of people from different communities participate in clinical trials in order to really reduce biases, promote social justice and health equity, and produce more innovative science as a whole. How might underrepresentation of specifically the patient populations that are most affected by specific disease states hinder the generalizability of the results of a study? And I'm going to pass that to you, Dr. Palmer.
Yes, overwhelmingly, our clinical trials have been done in a white population. And so therefore, it sets up the white population as the default population or the gold standard for which comparisons are being made. And so when we think about how we can move past that, if we prevent having diversity in our clinical trials, then we prevent financial dollars and resources, and the agendas are not set for these populations. They're underrepresented. So we don't have findings to justify the finances that we may need. In addition to that, it also leads to in vitro diagnostic companies not building out certain panels that are specific, that could actually lead in detection and ultimately lead into people living better lives. So we have to include diverse populations. I want to piggyback on what Dr. Puckrin said when we think about diversity again, is that have we thought about the use of diagnostics for our hearing impaired, our sight impaired? Have we thought about individuals who may or may not be able to contribute to the full onset of the clinical trial because maybe due to beliefs, spiritual beliefs, they're not allowed to take in certain therapeutics or receive certain synthetic products, but they still can contribute to a part of those clinical trials. And so I think thinking about what clinical trials are in the beginning of development and design, and finding innovative ways that people still can participate, because it is very hard if you're being reimbursed at the end of a clinical trial and you don't have the financial means to add to getting to those sites, or being at the collection draw site, or getting the scan that you need. So really being very creative and innovative, building people into these clinical trials is important.
Yeah, definitely important points to kind of drive home. And I'm gonna piggyback a little bit off of what you said, Dr. Puckering, and then also add to what you said, Dr. Palmer, as far as ensuring that we're linking to outcomes as well, and understanding that specific communities have various specific health outcomes that may be poorer than other communities, and really recognizing that. But then moving forward, creating potential solutions whereby we are more decentralized in our approach to clinical trial design, which is something that we're recognizing at Roche more and more so, conducting more introspective reviews and finding where do we currently have breaks in our clinical trial processes, and how do we optimize upon that. And Dr. Puckering, anything to add there?
I think we are at the cusp of some really exciting new science that's emerging. And we have to make sure that it's all inclusive, and even more importantly, that it's generalizable. And so making sure that our clinical trials are diverse, that they're in community, that people have access to them as part of the standard of care. It shouldn't be unusual that you get invited into a clinical trial. It ought to be another option for the clinician when they're meeting with the patient.
Definitely. And there's the limitations of certain communities really are doors of opportunity for innovation. And I hear that resonating from both what you said as well as what Dr. Palmer said as well. And this kind of leads us into our next question, which is there are these external dynamics at play as well that are also driving forces for ensuring that we are a bit more inclusive in our processes. For instance, the FDA recently released a guidance for industry focusing on the need for plans to enroll racial and ethnic minorities in studies, and went a step further to seek also to encourage sponsors to seek diversity beyond race and ethnicity, including age, comorbidities, and so forth, throughout the life cycle of a product. What strategies have you discovered to be effective in implementing this in your own practice? And would you be able to elaborate? And I'll start with you, Dr. Palmer.
Great. So just to think about race. Race is a social construct, and so there's no biological means to using race. And so I love how the FDA has stated that we need to go beyond that. And so we should start thinking about individuals that may be undergoing hormone treatment in our transitioning. Think of our transgender population. I talked earlier about sight and hearing impaired, but thinking about how can my institution be more inclusive, and as I participate in lead clinical trials, one of the key things is that I'm at a very large site. And so I'm attractive in that regards, but I am part of a very large network, and I understand and know the groups that are being underserved. And so it's very important that I partner with the clinical trialists to be able to pull in those individuals from the various hospitals so that they are represented in that. The other part of that is that when we think about how to capture, we're thinking about bringing someone in, having them scan, collecting blood in real time. But my colleagues and I have demonstrated and recently published that we can embed in a specimen collection within our own electronic medical record. And so therefore, we're not looking to know what your race is, what your sexual or gender identification is. We're looking to say, do you have these clinical symptoms? We get an alert, and we're able to pull those remnant specimens. And so this allows me to then go back into the data, be able to do downstream metabolomics, proteomics, looking at cytokine production, and all of this has been done without even bothering the patient. Whether it's an inpatient or an outpatient setting. And so I think we really need to think about how we can scale these type of virtual embedded biorepositories in order to get these samples, and in a collective manner be able to work out with our industry partners how we can perform downstream testing.
That's a fundamental point. That underlying sourcing of the specimen is so essential because it gives us the opportunity to really understand whether we do have diversity that we're aiming to achieve in the studies that we're looking to conduct. So that is a phenomenal point and a great best practice to implement. And Dr. Puckering, any additional examples there?
I would make 2 points there. One is, that race has sort of got us going down the wrong bunny hole, right? Because phenotype is not predictive of anything biologic of going on. And the point is that you can look phenotypically different, but saying the same disease pathway, respond to medicines in the same way. And so while we have to use race right now to clean up some of the mess in terms of the lack of diversity in our clinical trials, we shouldn't confuse ourselves to think that there's some science there that we're about to learn from race. So I think that's just a very, very critical point. The other thing I would say is that America is now getting very diverse. And I look at all of these wonderful companies here, the marketplace that you're going to be serving is going to be incredibly diverse. And so if you're developing new diagnostics that can't handle the diversity, then obviously your competitor is going to take advantage of that. And so part of what we say to companies is take a look around, right? 39% of the state of Texas is white, right? The majority of the population in California is Hispanic, Asians, and blacks. I mean, so America is changing. So the diagnostics, the clinical trials, all of those things have to follow suit. And I think they will. I think FDA sort of captured the moment, but I think the reality of where we are now is going to drive greater diversity in clinical trials.
I really appreciate that population health level lens that you just touched on, Dr. Puckering. I think that's important in really informing, what is our benchmark for success in terms of creating clinical trials for specific disease areas of interest. It's important to bear in mind, okay, who are the most afflicted populations? And how do we emulate that to look like the real world so that when clinicians, laboratorians are able to access results to our publications, that those publications are very relevant to the patients that they care for. And that's a great point to mention. And that really leads us into our last question, which is what opportunities exist for laboratorians to activate an approach at their home institutions to ensure that they capture a more diverse population within the scope of clinical trials. And Dr. Palmer, I'll start with you here.
Great. So I'm going to reuse some answers that I used earlier just to bring that home, is that laboratorians are leaders in this space. We generate data daily. And so all of our data can be used and has been used, and you've heard from various speakers before from Tricor. They've built out Lab 2.0. Roche has been very instrumental in setting up pathways and resources so that we can actually take ownership of that data. And so we're no longer, you bring in a sample and we give you a result. I say all that to say that we need to harness that data. And so we can start to look at care gaps. When we start to look at our care gaps and we see that those populations that are being underserved, and again, like Dr. Puckering noted, it's not about looking at race since it's a social construct, but really about who's being underserved rurally, centrally, in the urban areas. Those are the groups we should be building those clinical trials around. And as he noted, staff in clinical trials need to look like the population that they're trying to enroll. And then lastly, I would say that we have already, laboratorians, built relationships amongst our own departments. And so it is important that we get beyond our walls and realize that when they come to us with the design, the ideas of us supporting a clinical trial, really explaining to them, we know what our population looks like, here's the piece that should be added on, and really work through the process of ensuring that we're using the data that we're generating to make sure that all of our sites, all of our population is being represented.
That's a fantastic point, is leveraging data to really inform how we take action plans moving forward. I think that's something we don't do as much of, and hopefully we'll continue to utilize to inform moving forward. But that's something that also relies on data that is accurate, that is real, that really showcases and emulates the way that the real population currently stands. And that's a fantastic point to triumph. And Dr. Puckering, anything to add to that from that perspective?
I would always start with the data. Too much of our healthcare data is not accessible. And disease, when I look at the data, so the National Minority Quality Forum, we've been collecting health data now for 20 years. We have a database of over 5 billion patient records. Part of the reason why we did that, there are roughly 38,000 zip codes around the country where people live. 70% of African Americans live in 2,500 zip codes. So all this conversation about diversity in clinical trials is actually about 2,500 zip codes insofar as the African American community is concerned. The Hispanic community lives in about 2,500 zip codes. The Asian community about 1,500 zip codes. So 8,000 zip codes around the country is where the diverse populations in this country live. We don't have trials in those zip codes. That's the point, right? And so we can use the data not just to understand where those populations are, but we can also understand the diseases that challenge them. When you start to look at the data, you realize that cancer presents differently in populations. Some populations have higher risk, and so you can use that data to understand, oh, I may want to put my lung cancer trial in Kentucky because that looks like ground zero for cancer, lung cancer in the United States. And so my point is that you have to harness all of that kind of data to make sure that you're putting your clinical trials in the right place, that you're getting the affected populations into the trial, and then to make sure that you're recruiting those folks into the trial so that when your study and your diagnostic test comes back, it's actually applicable to the population that's going to need that the most.
That's such a great point, and it's such a way to round about our discussion today. And really working through the integrated approach that we need to take in order to build upon a more inclusive type of clinical research experience. Some of the key highlights that I really heard from both of you was, one, making sure that clinicians are asking the question to their patients, ensuring that there's no implicit bias there in enrollment within clinical trials. Two, engaging the community and really partnering with them to better understand what the unmet need is or what the obstacles are that exist for specific populations being enrolled within clinical trials. And then finally, really focusing in on those solutions, on how we can bring these potentially decentralized trials to the actual patients that we're looking to enroll, where we can meet them where they are. And I think that's a very essential point. And with that, I really appreciate having this discussion with you both today, and we will open the floor to questions from the audience.
Very nice discussion. So one of my questions, what Roche can do, what actions you're taking to facilitate all of those goals?
That's a fantastic question. So the question was, what is Roche doing in order to facilitate optimizing inclusivity in clinical trial design? So from the diagnostic perspective, we're really taking an introspective view currently on where our clinical trials exist and what communities we have in the past not included as much in clinical trial design. And from there, we're really focusing in on how we can bring the specific clinical trials and meeting patients where they currently exist. So we're focusing in on clinicians and potentially conducting more educations on implicit bias training. We're focusing on how exactly we can decentralize methods to ensure that patients have access to our specific products in order to better enroll them within our clinical trials. So that's where we currently stand now. Any other questions?
Thank you so much for an impactful session and for sharing all of your insights. At the end, you talked about data and the challenges of data, right? And how laboratorians are collecting it, but sometimes we're not putting it together. So my question is, how do we break down the silos between places so that we can share data and be able to develop the appropriate trials and et cetera to address all the underserved populations?
Dr. Peppergreen, do you want to take that?
I think that's a really profoundly important question. The way we are handling data right now limits our ability to actually help our populations because it's all siloed all over the place. Generally standardized, I think the technology is there so that we can get by on issues of standardization, but it's really the access issue. It's really making that data move, because what you want to do is you want to have data in the hands of the scientist when he has or she has the question that needs to be answered. And if they have to go fumbling around and going through barriers, and trust me, at the National Minority Quality Forum, we fight with data all the time, trying to get access to it. And so the future really is, how do we expedite the movement of health data? And I don't have the answer to that, but I'm telling you, that's where the future is. And the minute we speed that up, our ability to learn will go faster, and our ability to help populations will improve dramatically.
If I could just add to that. So there are like a host of initiatives that are all collecting data, and that is a good question. And I think it all lies into the fact that there is a sort of competition. And so we all want to be the first or the only to achieve something. With NIH, we have the All of Us research. The goal there is to get data on at least 1 million people. They have different consortiums. My institution is one of them, All of Us PA. And so the goal here, as Dr. Pulkren noted, is that it should be accessible. But one of the main things about this is de-identification. And on our plenary opening session on Sunday, we really learned about how to do de-identification in a manner so that we still can completely have the whole person without the person be de-identified. Because as we get more and more closer to molecular data, we know that that is an imprint, and we know that there are consequences to that leaking. So if the initiatives that are all pulling this data can do it in a fashion that's de-identified, using remnant samples, whether they're sourced in real time or later, then we can start building out accessibility. And I know that All of Us has allowed you to be able to pull that data so that you can use that. But we should be setting up our own alerts within our own institutions so that we can identify those care gap areas, which then would allow us to start disseminating that information in a collective manner.
Absolutely. Any other questions?
Thank you. So you're talking about the bring clinical trials to community. So we are in academic centers. What kind of bridge or pathways you can help us? We can reach out to the community and then we collaborate together, work together.
Many of our leading academic centers are actually in minority communities. Johns Hopkins is in East Baltimore, right? All they have to do is open the front door and ask them to participate in a clinical trial, but they're not asking. I think that's the point. When I look at the map, I see that these academic centers are sitting right in the middle of diverse populations. And so any moment they want to open the door and ask them to come participate, I think they'll find people who want to come into the study. So this is not a proximity issue. It's not an issue about whether the patient wants to participate in the trial or not. It's not an issue about whether we have clinical trials to do. The question is, ask.
And I think within these academic settings, we've built our relationships with our School of Public Health. And there are a host of faculty there that are in the community. They are doing maternal fetal medicine, identifying programs that mothers need to ensure that they don't have preterm delivery and ultimately have a higher risk for death. In addition to that, they're doing studies for congestive heart failure and hypertension. And so when they're bringing their research, their NIH research, American Heart, DOD-sponsored research, that is the role right there where the clinical chemist, the laboratorian can say, hey, I want to partner with you in this. I know where some of the care gaps are. I know you wrote this grant. but I'm going to help you recruit in those patients. And I think that's the true connection right there. Another thing I just like to say is that Roche has investigator-initiated projects. So we should be partnering. We have the instrumentation within our own laboratory. Reach out to the individuals that you're working with and really talk to them about some ideas that you have. And that's how we start to build out with our in vitro diagnostic experts and friends on really getting the studies that need to be done conducted in a timely manner. Hope I didn't overspeak on that.
No, that's exactly what I was going to lead with as well. We have a full medical and scientific affairs team at Roche distributed throughout the country. There are scientific liaisons out in the field. And any day of the week, we are always taking part in investigator-initiated studies throughout the country. So please feel free to find one of us, contact us. If you don't have our contact information, I'll provide it right after this session.
I would just add to be evangelical in this, right? Don't be an armchair scientist. You want to get in community, be part of the community, and I think you'll find people very, very receptive. I think if you go knock on the door, I think you'll find them very receptive.
Yeah, I would say one thing is that we all want to be altruistic, and we should really think about, if you want Octavia in this study, can you tell me if I'm going to see my results in real time? Can you tell me if I'm going to have any consequences? Like, really break it down to how I'm going to be able to use this. Is this for my grandchildren, my grandchildren's grandchildren? Like he said, you're embedded. I'm part of it. I'm a partnership. And that's one of the things that a lot of my community research colleagues do. They are within that community. It's not a new face. They participate, they live, they work in that community. And so really make sure that they are very clear about how they're partnering with you and how the research is going to be used downstream.
Absolutely. And very important point to note is that dynamic partnership between industry and academia. Back when I was in my academic years, we used to think of industry as kind of the dark horse, the dark side. We shouldn't go over there. However, come to find post-COVID, industry and academia really partner well together. We create really plausible solutions for patients, and it impacts patients on a day in, day out basis, and that's really important to recognize.
Yeah.
So with that, we round out our discussion unless there are any further questions. Excellent. Thank you so much to the panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Saeed.
Thank you very much.